So, the Union of Brest, which sought to unify the Catholic and Orthodox churches under the Pope, was a defining moment in the religious history of Europe. But honestly, it had the greatest fallout in the state where it originated, which is the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the Orthodox Christian reaction to the Union and to the Uniate Church, which it created, was overwhelmingly negative. The Orthodox backlash towards the perceived transgression of the Union was scathing, and it even escalated to violence, which marked the Union as one of the most important events in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth's history. But first, it's necessary to understand some context on the Union and the reasons that it came about in order to understand the Orthodox reaction to it. So, first, it's important to note that the Commonwealth was a very religiously diverse state. It had about similar numbers of Catholics and Orthodox Christians at the time of the Union, but Catholicism was the state religion, and Catholics made up the plurality of the population. So there were more Catholics in terms of numbers. And another important part, this will be important later, is that the two confessions were separated geographically, and the Orthodox Christians were concentrated in the eastern part of the Commonwealth, which is the green part on this map, and the Catholics sort of dominated the western part, which is the kind of beige color on this map. And despite these religious differences, this religious split, before the Union in 1596, the policy of the state towards the Orthodox was characterized by unprecedented toleration, which was pretty rare at the time in Europe, because at this time it was kind of embroiled in the violence of the Counter Reformation. But more on the Union itself. Um, Essentially, the purpose of the Union, or at least the Commonwealth's purpose, was to reconcile religious differences by bringing the Greek Orthodox masses of the Kievan metropolitan province under Rome and away from Constantinople and Moscow. So essentially, what this means is that Catholicism and Orthodoxy, they maintained separate church hierarchies under separate leaders. So on the one hand, you have the patriarch in Constantinople who led the Orthodox Church. He's on the left side here. And on the other hand, you had the Pope in Rome who led the Catholic Church, and he's on the right side of this slide. And what the Union did is it placed the Orthodox Church in the Commonwealth under the Pope's leadership while maintaining a lot of the liturgical differences between the churches. And this new Orthodox Church that was under the authority of the Pope was named the Uniate Church, or also it's known as the Greek Catholic Church. So that is the basics of the Union. Now, there were some issues arising right at the beginning, and a lot of the issues related to the Union stem from each side's, so that is the Orthodox side and the Catholic side, their conflicting visions for the Union, because they both understood it a little differently. And the Orthodox bishops who agreed to the Union, they sort of understood it to be an alliance of churches that are different, but they're still equal in dignity. But the Catholic side, they used the Union to create a uniate church as a part of the whole Roman Church without any exception and without any substantially specific status. So essentially, the Catholic vision was to have a subordinate uniate church rather than giving it equal status. And this subordinate position of the uniate church inspired the Orthodox backlash against the Union, which the Union kind of, for the Orthodox side, the Union came to be regarded as a product of foreign religious assault on the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox hierarchy and the masses didn't really support the Union, and they were driven, the Orthodox hierarchy was driven underground, and the masses remained true to it instead of converting to the Uniate Church. This is because essentially there was no difference between the Union and the Uniate Church. There was no difference between that and Catholicism in the minds of the masses. And a lot of these Orthodox Christians believed that the perceived persecution of Orthodoxy warranted a violent response. And this led to attacks on Uniate clergy all across the Commonwealth. But I want to highlight just one, which is arguably the most famous of these attacks, and it was a Orthodox mob's 1623 murder of Josafat Kuntsevich, who was the Uniate Archbishop of Polok in Vitebsk, which is modern day Belarus, I believe. And just to explain, I guess, the violence and the brutality of this murder, I think Kuntsevich's biographer, who was a fellow Uniate bishop named Iakov Susha, he laid out an account in his biography of Kuntsevich where he described the murder as an insurrection and that had broad participation, including from women and children. And he claimed in his account that someone hit Kuntsevich on the head with a stick and that another split it open with an axe. After which, the mob dragged him naked through the streets of the city, all the way to the hill overlooking the river Dvina, and after tying stones to his dead body, they threw him into the Dvina at its deepest. So, while I think Susha may exaggerate the mob's brutality to some degree, just given his perspective as a Uniate bishop, I think we can clearly see and we can clearly conclude that the Orthodox mob was violent and it was extremely vengeful in its attack on Kuntsevich. But nonetheless, many Orthodox Christians believed this and other instances of violence to be consequences of the Poles' efforts to compel the Orthodox to convert to an alien Catholic faith. So they kind of viewed all of this violence as justified. And I think it's also important to point out how the Catholics and the Uniates viewed this Orthodox Christian violence. So for instance, Kuntsevich was actually hailed by the Uniates of Poland, Lithuania as a martyr for their faith. And much later on, in 1867, he was canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, shortly before his canonization, the Polish painter Josef Simler depicted his murder in a painting titled Martyrdom of Josafat Kuntsevich, which you see on this slide. And I think this painting presents kind of like the Uniate and the Catholic perspective on this murder, as it juxtaposes the kind of this violent Orthodox mob on the left and Kuntsevich and his Uniate retinue on the right. And you see that Simler clearly draws focus to the victimhood of Kuntsevich and the Uniates in general. He paints their faces in the light, and meanwhile the mob's faces are all kind of undetailed side profiles, and they're in the dark. You can see in these blown up images on the right side of the slide. And essentially the conflicting Catholic / Uniate and Orthodox perspectives on Kuntsevich's murder highlight some of the extreme tensions in the Union, that the Union created among the Commonwealth's Christians. Now, Kuntsevich's brutal murder doesn't even fully capture the scale of the violent Orthodox response to the Union, which eventually actually took the form of a full-scale war. The Commonwealth's Orthodox peasantry, they turned to Orthodox warriors to defend them from perceived Catholic persecution, of course. And these warriors were called the Cossacks, which is a word that is derived from the Turkish term Kazakh, which means freebooting warrior or raider, which describes these warriors from modern day Ukraine pretty well. Essentially, the leader of the Cossacks was Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who led them as they kind of played the role of defenders of Greek Orthodoxy in this war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which began in 1648, and it was known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising. And the Cossacks were joined by burghers, some small gentry, and the peasant masses, with whose help they massacred hundreds of Uniate clergy and followers of the Union. And just to highlight the fact that this was a religiously motivated war, I think it's important to look at what Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky said himself. So in one speech that was documented by a Russian diplomat, Vasily Buturlin, Khmelnytsky justified the uprising by claiming that the Poles persecuted the Church of God and debauched all East Orthodox Christianity, and that they, quote, desired to extirpate the Church of God so that even the name Rus might not be remembered in our land. So you can see that Khmelnytsky is tying Orthodox Christianity to nationalism that's centered around the ancient Kievan Rus, which is an ancient state that both the Russian and the Ukrainian states claim to originate from. And this kind of elevates the Cossack struggle in importance from just like the religious level into essentially like an existential struggle for cultural survival. Because if the Cossacks lose, Rus will be erased from history. And Khmelnytsky, he also stated that the Polish gentry, quote, considered a Jew or a dog to be better than one of our Christian brethren. So here he's using anti-Semitism to highlight kind of like the degree of disdain that the Orthodox Christians perceived Catholics and Uniates to have for them. And it's also interesting to note that Khmelnytsky uses the term Christian brethren to refer to Orthodox Christians, because the Cossacks viewed Catholics and Uniates kind of just as unchristian heretics, and Orthodoxy was the only true form of Christianity, right? And while he was kind of dramatic in that speech, Khmelnytsky, his strong language, it was based in concrete persecution. Because, for instance, the Russian diplomat Buturlin, who wrote down that speech, he also notes in his diplomatic reports that Khmelnytsky previously mentioned that in Lithuania, Orthodox churches were sealed shut and others were converted to the Union in a petition he wrote to the Tsar of Russia. And modern scholars have corroborated this detail. I think David Frick, for example, noted that churches in the Lithuanian city of Wilno that were Orthodox in 1595, before the Union, were eventually turned over to the Uniates. So this was concrete persecution that was going on. And going back to the war itself, the Tsardom of Russia later joined the Cossacks in their campaign against the Commonwealth because they had kind of a shared Orthodox faith, and the Tsar also viewed himself as the protector of Orthodox Christians. And after a long period of fighting, the war ended in the Truce of Andrusovo, under which the Commonwealth ceded a significant portion of its territory to Russia. You see these like teal, turquoise regions on the eastern part of the Commonwealth. So, just to summarize everything that I've explained so far, the Union of Brest was a move through that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth sought to promote greater religious unity, sorry, in its territory by creating an Orthodox Church under the Pope's authority instead of the Orthodox Patriarch's authority. And it promoted an extremely negative Orthodox response. The majority of the Commonwealth's Orthodox Christians, and especially among the peasantry, resisted the Uniate Church, not just by refusing to convert to it, but by violently attacking the new church and the Commonwealth as a whole. And the violence started in more isolated incidents, like we saw with the Orthodox mob's murder of Uniate Archbishop Josafat Kunsevich, before it escalated to an organized mass campaign against the Commonwealth as a whole in the 1648 Khmelnytsky uprising. And ultimately, the Commonwealth's Orthodox Christians were successful in their resistance to the Uniate Church, as the Commonwealth ceded a significant portion of its majority Orthodox Eastern territory to the Orthodox Tsardom of Russia, which ended the perceived religious persecution of Orthodox Christians in those lands that were ceded. Yep, so that's all I had in my presentation. I hope you were able to learn something about the Union of Brest and especially about the Orthodox reaction to it in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.